The cord was in my inner chest pocket the morning I walked into the Kethorvath Sovereignty diplomatic station, for the first time in 23 years. I had carried it in the inner pocket of every field kit since the year she gave it to me. That was not a decision I had made consciously. It was simply a fact, the way the weight of a favorite tool becomes a fact, present enough that you notice its absence, unremarkable enough that you stop mentioning it. My sister had found it once, years ago, going through my kit at her kitchen table while I ate her soup, and told her I was fine. She had held it up and looked at me across the bowl and said nothing. I had put it back in the pocket, and she had looked at me a moment longer and then handed me more bread. It was a Velsorn memory cord. I had looked that up eventually, about 4 years after she gave it to me, when I had access to a decent archive terminal at a posting in the outer margin relay station at Sarin Orvath. Velsorn children made them from the age of 6 onward, woven reed fiber from the sovereignty's border estuaries, threaded with small pale beads of compressed mineral dust. Each bead was a memory the child chose to keep. The cord itself was the act of keeping. You gave it to someone when you wanted them to carry something of yours with them. The act of giving was the statement, I have made this, and I am placing it in your hands, and that is not nothing. She had been 9 years old. I had been 28. I understood, after I looked it up, what it had cost her. Not in terms of grief or loss. She was 9 and I was a minor compact cultural attaché she had known for one afternoon in a garden, and I do not imagine she lost sleep over the giving. But a Velsorn memory cord, once given, was not made again. You made one. You gave it. The child who made it had chosen 9 memories to keep, had pressed each one into a bead, had woven the fiber with care and attention, and had then placed the entire accumulated record of her most important things into someone else's hands. You did not do that without meaning it. She had meant it. She was 9. She had meant it the way 9-year-olds mean things, which is entirely and without reservation, and that was not a small thing to have been given. I had spent most of the morning before the sessions reviewing my materials in the anteroom off the main archive corridor. The Compact's cultural delegation was not large, 8 people total, with Secretary General Velorvath, Ren's primary diplomatic team, occupying the 2 main conference rooms on the east side of the station. My role was the cultural records portfolio, inventory of shared archive materials, assessment of the bilateral cultural exchange documentation that had been suspended when the rupture happened, and liaison to the Velsorn Sovereignty's own archivist, a compact and careful man named Keeper Sale Velmuin, who had met me at the station entrance with the measured courtesy of a man who had been told to be courteous, and had decided to do it correctly regardless of what he thought. He was polite, he was not warm, that was fair. 22 years of rupture had consequences that went past the political. The Compact's withdrawal from the Velsorn diplomatic framework in the year of the Thresorvath border dispute had closed every shared institution, every cultural exchange program, every archive link. The people who had been in the middle of those programs when the shutters came down had simply stopped, filed their last reports, turned in their credentials, walked out of stations that would not reopen for a generation. The archivists had been the last to leave, because archivists always are. There are always more materials than you expected, and someone has to log them properly even in a withdrawal. I had been one of the cultural personnel, not the last, not the most distinguished, but one of them. I had not been important enough to be recalled dramatically. I was a junior cultural attaché, 2nd year of my first field posting, and my recall had come as a standard administrative notification on a Wednesday morning. All compact cultural personnel to withdraw from Velsorn sovereignty stations within 96 hours, pending further review. Further review had taken 22 years. I had been 28. I was 51 now, gray at the temples and through most of the sides of my hair, with the weathered quality that long field work puts in a face. Not distinguished, not striking, just the face of someone who has spent a lot of years in variable lighting in rooms where the climate control was maintained to the standards of the station rather than to his personal preference. In those 22 years, I had done other things. Outer margin cultural liaison work at postings that did not involve the Velsorn. A decade of archival field work for the Compact's Records Office, cataloging the cultural heritage documentation of 3 smaller sovereignty systems, whose populations had been displaced by the Thresh-Emil border conflict. Work that mattered, and that no one particularly noticed mattering, which was the character of most work worth doing. A return to central operations at 50, when my field posting days were winding down, and the records office needed someone who had enough gray in his hair to be taken seriously in a conference room. I was thorough and I was still standing, and in the records office those 2 qualities were enough to build a career on. When the Compact reopened diplomatic channels with the Velsorn sovereignty 2 years ago, the cultural records portfolio had been placed on the table as a relatively low-stakes component of the broader bilateral framework, easier to negotiate around than the trade provisions or the border security annexes, useful as a gesture of good faith, complicated enough that it required someone who actually knew the prior materials. Secretary General Wren had asked for someone with direct prior Velsorn posting experience to handle the archive liaison role. There were not many of us left who were still working. I had raised my hand. Delegation Lead Coordinator Maurice Velorveth, no relation to the Secretary General, the Velorveth name was common enough in the Central Compact, had not been enthusiastic about my inclusion. She was 41, sharp, politically precise, and she had made it clear in our pre-departure briefing that the cultural records portfolio was a supporting function, and was not to introduce personal dimensions into proceedings that required strict professional framing. She had looked at me in a specific way when she said that. I had looked back at her in a specific way and said I understood completely. I had not told her about the cord. I had not told her about the 9-year-old girl in the courtyard garden of the old Velsorn diplomatic mission house, 23 years ago, pressing a woven thing into my hands with the gravity only a child can bring to a small gesture. That was not Coordinator Velorvath's information to have. Not because it was secret, it was simply personal, and personal things were mine to hold until there was a reason to put them down. That had been the last afternoon, before the recall notification. I had been in the garden because the station's interior had been loud with the particular tension of a diplomatic framework beginning to fracture. I could read it in the way the senior staff were talking to each other, in the length of the silences between statements that should have had quick answers, in the way Compact personnel were suddenly auditing their materials with the specific thoroughness of people who expect to be asked to leave soon. I had gone outside to write my end-of-week report in peace. She had been in the garden because I had never known exactly why. She was the 3rd princess of the Kethorvath sovereignty branch, which made her a minor royal figure at that posting, present because her mother, a senior sovereignty advisor, had brought her along during what was supposed to be a routine goodwill session that had since become something considerably less routine. The child had the look of someone who had decided the adult situation was not her concern and had found a better occupation. She had been moving through the garden with the focused attention of a child conducting a private survey, stopping at each plant to assess it, crouching occasionally to look at something near the ground, running her fingers along the leaf edges of the estuary plantings along the south wall. She had stopped near the bench where I was sitting and looked at me. I had looked back. "You write a lot," she had said, in careful compact standard with a slight Velsorn cadence. She had been learning it. Her tutor would have started her on the formal registers, and she had not yet worn them smooth. "It is my job," I had said. "What do you write?" "Reports, records, notes about what we are doing here and why." She had considered that. "Does anyone read them?" "My supervisor reads them. Eventually someone files them." She had sat down on the other end of the bench, at a distance that felt deliberate, close enough for conversation, far enough to be making a choice. She had deep amber gold skin and close-cropped dark bronze hair and pale silver eyes that had the quality of a morning sky just before it makes up its mind about the day. She was carrying a small woven cord in her hands, turning it over, the pale beads catching the garden light as she worked. "I am Ethys," she had said, with the directness of a child who has been told that introductions are done a certain way and has decided that the formal version takes too long. "I am Davin," I had said. We had talked for another half-hour. She had told me about every plant in the garden. She had, in fact, surveyed all of them and could report on each one with the authority of a child who has decided something is her domain. The amberleaf estuary vine did not flower in the mission house's light cycle. The conditions were wrong. She had told me this with the patient precision of someone explaining a thing that ought to be obvious to anyone paying attention. The wide-leaf pressure fern along the north wall was doing better than it should, because someone had overpressurized the water line, and it was getting more moisture than the groundskeeper intended, and the groundskeeper had not noticed yet. The small bead river moss in the corner planter was the same genus as the reed fiber she used for her memory cords, which she had told me was an interesting fact that most people did not know and did not seem particularly interested in learning. I had told her about the records I was writing. She had decided that writing things down so they were not forgotten was an adequate thing for a person to do with their time. She had been reassessing me as I talked, with the specific quality of a child who came in with a preliminary judgment and was updating it based on evidence. By the end of the half hour, her preliminary judgment had, apparently, been updated favorably, because she had stood up and held out the cord. "This is for you," she had said. I had looked at it in her hands. "I cannot take that, it is yours." "I made it," she had said, with the patient precision she used for the things that should be obvious. "That means I can give it to whom I choose. I choose to give it to you. You are a person who writes things down so they are not forgotten. I think you should have something to remember." I had taken it. The next morning the notification had come, and 96 hours later I had walked out of the Velsorn Sovereignty Mission house with my field kit packed and the cord in the inner chest pocket, and I had not been back until now. The anteroom off the main archive corridor was small and well lit, with a long table of pale stone and a set of shelving units along the east wall that held the physical archive materials the Velsorn had agreed to make available for review. Keeper Velmuin had set up the materials according to the inventory list I had sent ahead 6 weeks prior, category flagged, chronologically organized, each section separated by a thin metal divider with a handwritten index notation that matched the digital catalog. It was excellent archival practice, the kind that comes from someone who has thought carefully about how a stranger ought to be able to navigate a collection they do not know. I had noted that in my first morning report, and I meant it. Keeper Velmuin had received the note with the expression of a man who does not expect to receive such notes from visiting compact delegations, and was therefore uncertain what to do with this one. I was working through the cultural exchange documentation from the pre-rupture years, specifically the Joint Performing Arts program that had been suspended midway through its 3rd season, when I heard the door at the far end of the corridor open. I did not look up immediately. Keeper Velmuin had been in and out twice since morning, and the sound had the same quality, a door that opened quietly, a step that was practiced at not announcing itself. I finished the notation I was making and looked up. It was not Keeper Velmuin. She was 33 years old. She had turned 33 in the 3rd month. I had noted it in a file I kept that I had never told anyone about, not even my sister. She was taller than I remembered, though I had not been paying careful attention to her height when she was 9. She wore the Sovereignty's formal diplomatic attire, deep gray-green with gold edging at the collar and cuffs, the Kethorveth branch's sovereignty seal on the left side of her chest, her close-cropped dark bronze hair unchanged in its cut though 23 years older. Her skin was the same deep amber gold. Her eyes were the same pale silver, and they had kept the quality I remembered, the sky that hasn't decided yet, though there was more behind them now than a morning's worth of assessment. There were 23 years behind them, and a sovereignty, and whatever it had cost to become the person wearing that attire in this station. She had stopped in the doorway of the anteroom and was looking at me. I did not move. I was not certain my legs would have cooperated if I had tried. I had imagined this moment, in the abstract way you imagine things you do not truly expect to happen, and in none of those imaginings had I accounted for the specific sensation of it being real, of her being real, and in a doorway 7 meters away, looking at a face she was trying to place. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone trying to match a name to a fact they already half know, and then something in her eyes shifted. "You are the cultural records officer," she said. Her compact standard was no longer careful or effortful. It was the standard of someone who had been working in bilateral frameworks for years, fluent and unremarkable, a working language as worn smooth as good tools. "Yes," I said, "Davin Mail, Senior Cultural Records Liaison, Compact Records Office." She stood in the doorway a moment longer. Her expression had not quite settled. It was still in the middle of something. "You were here before," she said. Not quite a question, something firmer than a question. 23 years ago, I was a junior cultural attaché, second posting. The silence between us had the quality of a room adjusting to a change in pressure. The kind of silence that happens after something has shifted before either party has acknowledged the shift. She took one step into the anteroom. Her eyes had not left my face. "The garden," she said. I did not answer immediately. There were things you could say at a moment like that and things you could not, and the ones you could say were not always the ones that were true, and the true ones were not always the ones that were ready. I looked at her for a moment across the length of the table, and then I said, "Yes." She came the rest of the way into the room and stopped at the corner of the long table, a meter away from where I was sitting. The formal diplomatic attire looked settled on her, not like a costume, like something she had grown into over a long time, and now wore the way I wore my field archivist's vest, with the ease of things that have been the same through many changes. "I have been in 3 sessions this morning," she said. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that was doing careful work. "The Secretary General's team is deliberate and thorough. I appreciate that. There are 22 years of framework to rebuild, and they are approaching it correctly." "They are a strong team," I said. "Keeper Velmuin tells me the archive materials are in good order." "Excellent order. He is a skilled archivist." She nodded. Her eyes moved to the table, to the flagged materials, and then back to me. "What was your focus this morning?" "The Joint Performing Arts Program. Season 3 materials, the documentation that was current when the withdrawal happened. There is a complete record of the first 2 seasons' exchanges, well catalogued. The 3rd season's materials are partial, about 60% complete. There are gaps I will need to cross-reference against Central Compact records to fill, if the Velsorn sovereignty is willing to pursue that work." "We are willing," she said, and then more quietly, "It was a good program. I attended 3 of the performances in the first season. My mother brought me." "Your mother was the senior sovereignty advisor," I said, "at the pre-rupture mission house. I found her in the archive documentation about 9 years into my work on Velsorn cultural records. She was cited in the joint program's founding agreements." Another shift in her eyes. She had not expected me to know that. Not the fact, the context of it, the fact that I had been looking. "I read everything I could find," I said. "In the years after, about the Velsorn sovereignty. The political framework, the cultural programs, the sovereignty's development, the succession question in the Kethorveth branch. I was posted elsewhere for most of those years, but the archive terminals and outer margin postings have access to the public record, and I stopped. This was the edge of the thing I was not supposed to introduce into professional proceedings. Coordinator Velorvath's voice was audible in my memory with specific clarity. She looked at me steadily. But what? I kept reading, I said. That is all. She was quiet for a moment. There was something in her expression that was working out what to do with that sentence, turning it over the way she had turned the memory cord in her hands in the garden. Then she said, "You were recalled, the morning after." Yes. I did not know that immediately. I was 9. My mother told me later that the compact cultural personnel had been withdrawn due to the political situation, but by then we were home and it was already over. She paused. I thought about the reports afterward, the ones you said you wrote so things would not be forgotten. I filed my last report from the mission house the morning of the recall notification, I said. I had started a section on the garden plantings. I was not able to finish it before the withdrawal window closed. The amberleaf vine, she said, with a sudden precision. Among others. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite grief, something that lived in the space between them. She looked at the table again at the flagged archive materials. Then she said, "The sessions resume in 40 minutes. I came to the archive corridor too." She stopped. I am not certain why I came to the archive corridor. The performing arts program was excellent, I said. Seasons 1 and 2, if you ever want to review the materials. She looked at me. There was a pause that was not quite like the other pauses in this conversation. It had a different weight to it. Then she said, "Davin Mail." Yes. You were kind to me, she said. In the garden. No one was unkind to me. I was 9 and I was a third-line princess and everyone was careful and correct. But you were kind. That is a different thing. I did not know what to say to that. I had not expected her to say it, and I had spent 23 years imagining many versions of this conversation in the way you imagine things you do not truly expect to happen, and in none of those versions had she said that first. In most of them she had not remembered me at all, and I had accepted that as the probable outcome because it was the reasonable one. She had been 9. I had been an unremarkable junior attaché for one afternoon. These were not the conditions under which a person gets remembered. You were kind to me also, I said. You gave me a complete survey of every plant in that garden. I had been in the mission house for 7 weeks, and I had not known what a single one of them was called. That got something that was almost a smile. Almost. It was restrained by the same effort that had been holding her expression level since she walked in, but the effort was less effective than it had been. The amberleaf estuary vine, she said, does not actually flower in the diplomatic station's light cycle. The conditions are wrong. Every year the groundskeepers are surprised when it doesn't flower, and every year I could have told them it wouldn't. I have that in my notes, I said, from the report I filed the morning of the withdrawal. I managed to include the amberleaf vine before the window closed. She looked at me very directly. You put the amberleaf vine in your report. You told me about it. I wrote down what you told me. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the anteroom's single window, which faced the station's interior courtyard, I could see the afternoon light beginning its long shift toward the gold register that characterized this part of the sovereignty's home system, a warmer angle that caught the pale stone surfaces and turned them amber. The courtyard had an estuary planting along its south wall. I had looked at it when I arrived and thought about telling her. She was still looking at me. The careful work her expression had been doing had changed its character. It was still careful, but it was careful in a different direction now, more inward than outward. There is something I want to show you, I said, if you will permit it. She waited. I reached into the inner chest pocket of my field vest and took out the cord. It was small, the length of my palm. the reeds woven into a flat braid no wider than 2 fingers, the pale mineral beads threaded at intervals along its length. 23 years had not been entirely kind to it. The reeds had dried and stiffened and then softened again through enough different climates that they had settled into something between their original texture and leather, supple in a way that was not their original suppleness but was not fragile either. The beads were intact, all 9 of them pale gray against the weathered reed fiber, the compressed mineral unchanged. The braid was intact. I had not done anything special to preserve it. I had simply carried it, and the inner pocket of a well-made field vest turned out to be a protective environment across 2 decades of postings. I held it out to her. I watched her look at it. She was very still. The way you go still when your body catches up to something your mind is still processing, when the thing you are looking at is real but your nervous system has not yet decided what to do with real. Her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, lifted slightly and then stopped. Her expression had done something I could not name. It had moved past all the framework she had been managing behind it and arrived somewhere else entirely. I watched her pale silver eyes fill. She did not look away from the cord. She looked at it with an expression I had not seen on an adult face before, or perhaps I had, but never directed at something I was holding. It was the expression of someone who has lost something so long ago that they have stopped imagining what it would feel like to find it, and then the thing is in front of them, and the body knows before the mind does, and the mind catches up all at once, and the catching up happens in the eyes first. She put her hand over her mouth. She was quiet for a long moment. I could see the effort she was making, a queen, in formal diplomatic attire, 40 minutes before a bilateral session, in a room with a compact archivist she had met twice in her life and not seen in 23 years. I could see all of that working in her. And I could see the moment it stopped working, because the tears came anyway, quietly and completely, the way water finds the level it is going to find regardless of what you build to stop it. They were not dramatic tears. They were the tears of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just put it down, and the body marks the putting down with the same quiet certainty with which it marks everything that matters. She breathed in slowly. She lowered her hand. Her eyes were wet and she did not attempt to conceal this. She looked at the cord and then she looked at me. "You kept it," she said. "Yes," I said. She reached out and touched the edge of the cord, not taking it, just the edge, 1 finger on the reed braid, the way you touch something to confirm it is real. 23 years. Yes. Through the recall, through all of it. It was in my kit, I said. Every posting, the outer margin relay stations, the Threshamil cultural documentation work, the posting at Velorvath 12 during the border security revision, the years at Central Records. It was in the inner chest pocket. She looked at me. Her eyes were still wet. She was making no effort to manage that now. Why? It was the only question that mattered. I had known she would ask it if we ever arrived here, and I had not known, for 23 years, what the true answer was. I had told myself different things at different times, that it was a habit I had never gotten around to changing, that it was a memento of my first posting, that it was a small thing, and the pocket was a useful pocket, and inertia is a powerful force. All of those things had been true in the way that the surface explanations for a thing are true without being the explanation. None of them had been the answer. I looked at her and I told her the truth. "Because you were 9 years old," I said, "and you made something with your hands and you gave it to me and you told me I should have something to remember. And I thought about that for 23 years, not every day, but when it mattered. When I was in a posting that was difficult or in a situation that felt like it wasn't worth the effort, I would find the cord in my pocket, and I would think about a 9-year-old girl who believed that a person who writes things down so they are not forgotten is worth giving something to, who believed the work was worth doing enough to give the work something to remember itself by." I paused. I did not need a souvenir of the Velsorn sovereignty. I had a great many of those in my archive materials. I had a souvenir of the belief, of being told, by someone who had no reason to tell me anything, that paying attention was a sufficient thing for a person to do. She looked at me for a long time. The tears had not stopped, but she was not fighting them. Her chin was perfectly level. Her posture was the posture of a queen, and there was nothing in it that was performing composure. It simply was composure, the deep kind that has room for grief inside it without being undone by the grief, the kind you build over a long time and a great many difficult years. "I made it," she said quietly, "because you told me you wrote things down so they would not be forgotten. I thought that was the most important thing a person could do. I was 9, and I thought it was obvious." She paused. "I gave you the cord because I wanted you to have something to remember that I thought that I had been in a garden with a person who paid attention, and that it had seemed to me at 9 years old that this was the rarest possible thing, and it deserved to be kept." Another pause, and then, with something that was a new layer underneath the grief, "I did not think you would actually carry it." "It is a very good cord," I said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. She looked down at the cord in my hand. Then she looked up at me. "I became the queen in the 15th year after the rupture," she said. "The Kethorvath branch succession question had been unresolved since my grandmother's line ended, and in the 15th year it resolved in my favor. It was a complicated year. Many things were complicated." She said this with the evenness of someone who has made peace with a complicated year by living through several more of them, and finding that the peace is real and not merely strategic. "In the 18th year I began advocating internally for the reopening of the bilateral framework with the compact. Not for political reasons alone. There were political reasons, and they were real, and I used them. But I also had a memory of a garden and a bench and a person who wrote down what I told him about an amberleaf vine in a report because I had told him about it, and I thought, there should be a way back to that. There should be something that can be rebuilt, with people who pay attention on both sides." I was quiet. "I did not know if you would be part of the delegation," she said. "I did not know if you were still working or where, or whether the records office would include someone with prior Velsorn posting experience in the cultural portfolio." She looked at the cord. "When Keeper Velmuin told me this morning that the Compact's senior cultural records officer was named Davin Mail, I did not." She stopped. "I needed to see the archive corridor." "I am glad you did," I said. She looked at the cord again, then she looked at me. "May I hold it?" I placed it in her hand. She held it carefully, both hands, the cord lying across her palms, her head bent slightly to look at it the way you look at something you once made when you were young and find again and recognize as a fact about who you were. I watched her touch each bead with one finger, slowly, moving from the first to the last, the way you account for things you thought were gone. There were 9 beads. I had counted them years ago when I looked up the memory cord tradition and learned what the beads were. "I remember each one," she said softly. "I was 9 and I thought the things I chose were very important, and I was right. I still think so." She paused at the 3rd bead. "This one is the garden, the one at the mission house." I was very still. "I did not know that." "This one," the 5th bead, her finger resting a moment, "is my mother reading to me. The evenings before the formal sessions, when she would bring me to her room and read until I fell asleep because the diplomatic quarters were never quiet enough. And this one, the 7th bead, is the first time I saw the estuary reeds. I was 4 years old, and my grandmother took me to the southern border estuary on the homeworld, and I thought they were the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen. I still think that, actually. I think the amberleaf vine is extraordinary," I said, "based on the report I received from the subject matter expert." She looked up at me. The tears had slowed, but her eyes were still bright with them, and there was something else in them now, something that was not grief and not relief, but was in the space past both of them, where things settle after the long wait is over. based on the subject matter expert's report. She was very thorough, I said. I have rarely received a better field survey. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something she had not done yet in this conversation. She looked at me without any of the frameworks around it. Not the queen, not the diplomat, not the child I had known or the adult I was only beginning to know correctly. Just looked at me, clearly and completely, the way she had looked at the plants in the garden when she was 9 and had decided something was her domain. Davin Mail, she said, Senior Cultural Records Liaison. Yes. I am going to introduce you to my court this afternoon, she said, after the session, not as the compact cultural records officer, as the person who carried something I gave him for 23 years. She paused. I want them to know what that means. I did not argue with this. I understood that it was not a question, and I understood what she was saying, and I understood that the appropriate response to being recognized by someone who has thought carefully about recognition was to accept it without deflection. There will be people, I said carefully, who think that is an unusual thing to introduce in a diplomatic bilateral framework. Yes, she said, Coordinator Velorvath will think that. I know Coordinator Velorvath's category of objection very well. She is not wrong about many things, and this will not be one of the things she is right about. She looked down at the cord in her hands. 23 years, Davin. 23 years, I said. She was quiet a moment, and then she said, The sessions resume in 35 minutes. I should return. Yes, I said. She held the cord out to me. I looked at it. Keep it, I said. She looked at me very steadily. It was yours, you carried it. You made it, I said. You told me that means you can give it to whom you choose. You chose me once. I am choosing to return it to its maker. She held my gaze for a long moment. I could see her working out whether to argue and deciding not to. She closed her fingers around the cord. Thank you, she said. It was a small sentence and it held a great deal. The 23 years in it, and the garden, and the beads, and the amber leaf vine that would not flower, and something forward-facing that did not have a name yet but was beginning to have one. She straightened and the queen came back into her posture, not as a mask but as a fact, the way it always was, the way she had grown into it over years until it was simply how she stood. She turned toward the door and then she stopped. The amber leaf vine, she said without turning back. In the courtyard, south wall. Did you look at it when you arrived? First thing this morning, I said. The light is wrong again. It will not flower this season. I will put that in my report, I said. She was quiet for a moment, then she walked out. I sat in the anteroom for another few minutes before I went back to the performing arts documentation. The afternoon light had settled into its amber register fully by then, coming through the anteroom window and lying across the pale stone of the table in a long, warm stripe. The inner chest pocket of my field vest was lighter than it had been that morning, and I was aware of the lightness without being troubled by it. Some things you carry until you don't have to anymore, and the not having to is not a loss. It is the completion of the carrying. The afternoon session ran 3 hours. I was not in the main conference room. My role kept me in the archive corridor and its anteroom, working through the documentation with Keeper Velmuin, who had by the 3rd hour shifted from measured courtesy to something closer to collegial efficiency. He was a precise man, and he respected precision. By late afternoon he had begun volunteering context I had not asked for, which is what archivists do when they have decided a colleague is worth the extra effort. At the close of the afternoon session, I was called into the main diplomatic hall by a sovereignty attendant. The hall was large, pale stone walls, formal seating along both sides, the Velsorn sovereignty seal inlaid in the floor at the center, the overhead lighting calibrated to the cool gold register of late afternoon. The Secretary General's team was already arranged on the compact side. The full Velsorn diplomatic corps, 12 people in formal attire, was arranged on the sovereignty side. Coordinator Velorvath was at the center of the compact, grouping with the expression of someone who has been told that a thing is going to happen and has decided that her objection is formally on record, and she is going to stand here professionally regardless. Ethys was at the head of the room. She stood the way she had in the anteroom, the posture of someone who has been the queen for a long time and carries it without effort. She held the cord in her left hand, not displayed, just held, the way you hold something that belongs to you. She introduced me to her court simply and without ceremony, which made it more complete than ceremony would have. She said my name. She said I had been a junior cultural attaché at the Velsorn Mission House 23 years ago, and that on the last afternoon before the compact withdrew its cultural personnel, I had spoken to her in the garden, and she had given me a memory cord she had made herself. She said that this afternoon I had taken the cord from my field vest pocket, where I had carried it for 23 years without interruption, and shown it to her. She said, a person who keeps a thing for 23 years is not keeping a souvenir, they are keeping a belief. He believed that the work of paying attention was worth doing, and that what a 9-year-old told him about a garden mattered enough to be written down and remembered, and that something given in good faith was worth carrying. I want you to know who he is. This framework is being rebuilt by people on both sides, and I want you to know the quality of the people on the other side of this table. Coordinator Velorvath was very still, not displeased or displeased and beyond it, in the place where you go when you understand before you react, and the understanding takes precedence. The court received the introduction with the gravity it warranted. There was a Velsorn acknowledgement gesture I had read about, a formal open palm positioning that indicated recognition of a stated fact, and I saw it from 2 members of the court, and then from a third, and then from Keeper Velmuin, who was standing near the archive corridor door, and who performed the gesture with the composed precision of a man who has just revised his assessment of a visiting colleague, and is doing so formally and on the record. Afterward, while the hall cleared, Ethys came to where I was standing near the door. She still held the cord, turned once in her fingers. Coordinator Velorvath will want to speak with you tomorrow, she said. I expect so, I said. She is not wrong that this is unconventional. She is wrong about whether it matters for the framework. The framework is made of the people in it. If the people in it are people who carry things for 23 years and return them to their makers, that is what the framework is made of. I looked at her. That is a very good case. I have been making cases for 23 years, she said. I have had practice. She looked at the cord once more, and then she looked at me, and I saw in her eyes the thing that had been there since the anteroom, the cleared quality of someone who has been waiting for something without quite admitting they were waiting, and the wait is over. There is a courtyard bench, she said, the south-facing one near the estuary planting. I saw it this morning, I said. The archive sessions resume at the 9th hour tomorrow. The courtyard bench is available before then. I understood. I will be there, I said. She nodded. She started to turn, and then she looked at the cord one more time. The third bead, she said. I told you it was the garden. I did not tell you that when I made this cord. I had not yet decided what the third bead was for. I was sitting on the bench working on it and trying to choose, and then you sat down, and by the end of the afternoon I knew. She turned and walked out through the far door. The hall was empty. The amber light was on the stone. The inner pocket of my field vest was light. I went back to the anteroom and picked up my materials and my vest, and I stood there for a moment with my hand on the pocket, feeling the absence, which was not emptiness. It was the shape left by something that had been carried for 23 years and had finally arrived where it was going. That shape was its own kind of weight, and it was not an unpleasant one. I went to find Keeper Velmuin. We had not finished the performing arts documentation, and I had told him I would be available to continue in the evening, and I kept the commitments I made. He met me at the anteroom door with 2 cups of concentrate and the index for the Season 3 materials already open on the table, and we worked until the station lights shifted to their evening cycle, and the window showed the courtyard dark and still. He said, as we were organizing the materials to close for the night, without looking up from the index, "The cultural records portfolio has been unattended for 22 years. It will take more than one session to do it properly." "It will take several years," I said. "Yes," he said, and then, still not looking up, "The keeper's office will be available at the 8th hour, if you want to begin earlier than the 9th. I told him I would be there at the 8th hour. He nodded, as though this had been expected and confirmed. The courtyard bench was south-facing. In the morning the light would come across the estuary planting along the south wall at a low angle, the way good light comes when it has found the right hour and the right surface and is not in any hurry to move on. The amberleaf vine was there, its long runners trailing across the pale stone, patient and unchanged. It would not flower this season. The conditions were wrong, and they had been wrong for some time. I was going to tell her. She was going to tell me she already knew. That would be enough for a beginning.